Throughout the novel of The Secret Life of Bees, there is a constant theme of death giving way into life. Sometimes the resulting life is good and sometimes it's not so good. One of the lives that came out of Lily's mother's death wasn't so good at first. Lily, who was 4 at the time, picked up a loaded gun that she didn't know was loaded, and she accidentally shot her mother. It was a complete accident. However, Lily's whole life was surrounded by her guilt and her internal questioning of why me? Why do I have to deal with this? So that's how Lily's life was so negatively affected by her mother's death. However, the resulting life can sometimes be good. May, one of the Calendar sisters that Lily meets later in the novel, commits suicide because she just can't handle the pain of life anymore. However, June, May's sister, gets married to Neil when before Neil was persistent on getting married, but June was hesitant. So May's death brought the good life and the new life that June and Neil will share as a married couple. Towards the end of the novel, Lily truly accepts her mother's death and truly accepts what has happened to her and her mother's history and chooses to move on. And so that new life that Lily is going to start leading is a new life that came from the death of her old life and the new choices that she's going to make. The first example of how death gives way into life from the book is when Lily says, "People who think dying is the worst thing don't know a thing about life." Here we can see that Lily is still being negatively affected by her mother's death. The second example comes when August is still dealing with the death of her sister May. She says, "Putting black cloths on the beehives is for us. I do it to remind us that life gives way into death. And then death turns around and gives way into life." These two examples show that the author truly believes that death gives way into life. Dr. Hartscrabble, in your opinion, what are some scientific examples of how life comes from death?
Well, one great example is the day after night. Day usually represents life and brightness, and followed by night, which can represent death. In addition to, another great example is winter and spring, these seasons. Winter, a lot of things die, and it's death, followed by spring, which can bring new life to many, many things. And another example would be dead organisms become fertile soil, and that fertile soil can really help new organisms and plants.
In your opinion, what are some examples of how life comes from death?
Well, I think the most obvious examples of where life comes from death we see in nature all around us. Of course, nature is around us all the time, so these things become not so obvious because we're accustomed to seeing them. In fact, this was the premise of the very popular movie back in the 80s, The Lion King, The Circle of Life, and all of that movie hinged on how life comes out of death. And so the classic examples we see in nature is natural disasters like a forest fire, or even a volcano or a massive flood where it wipes out the entire life. Let's take the extreme example of Mount St. Helens in the 80s when there was nothing on that mountainside and the entire mountain was lifeless. It was just ash and rock. And if you were to look at that site today, it's almost nearly 100% forested. So life has come back, and that made an opportunity for new life to come back into those areas. Biology has a word for that. That's a saprophyte. Those are living organisms that live off of dead organisms. So they could only live if something else dies. You can take a small example in your garden. When you remove some plants or you thin out some trees, that makes room for other plants to grow that normally wouldn't be able to grow under their canopy. So the death of one thing is, in almost all cases, an opportunity for another living organism.
So are there any other examples that you can think of where life comes from death?
Well, that's is the centerpiece of the gospel message that the Christians believe. The sacrifice of Jesus coming to the earth, living as a full human being, and then willingly giving up his earthly life is the reason the Christians believe that they have spiritual life after they physically die. That's the centerpiece of the entire Christian belief system, is that to pay the price for the sin which God demands by his righteousness. The only way we could appeal to God's sense of justice was a sacrifice of his son and his death on the cross, so that we could be in right standing and be considered holy by God when we enter into his presence, which happens after our physical death. One thing that I think a lot of people don't understand is that God made all his people spiritual beings, and all of us that have ever physically lived have a spirit within us, and that spirit is eternal. That will never be lost even after each and every one of us physically dies. The big question is, where does that spirit reside in eternity? And God's word tells us it either resides with him or it doesn't. And when it's not with him, it's in a place called hell, and when it's with him, it's in God's home, which is heaven. So when we physically die, our spirit moves on, and we exist in a spiritual realm, and then like I said before, either in one of those two areas.